Hi there. You're listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast with your host, me, Simon Drew. If you'd like to listen to over 200 episodes that were recorded before 2020, then you can head to my Patreon site. It's patreon.com/Simon J.E. Drew. We'd love to have you there, and any support is greatly appreciated. We'd love to also have you on our Facebook community, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But for now, enjoy the show. Hi there, my name's Simon Drew, and welcome to the Practical Stoic Podcast. Now, today I've got a really fascinating conversation for you that I had with Dr. Dan Dworkis around using Stoicism to make yourself better prepared for emergency situations, to act effectively in those situations. So for context, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dan, and then we're going to jump straight into this awesome interview. So, Dr. Dan Dworkis is a board-certified emergency physician and the founder of the Emergency Mind, which brings together lessons from experts in the emergency department and beyond on developing the tools it takes to succeed during times of crisis and apply knowledge under pressure. So Dr. Dworkis received his MD and a PhD in molecular medicine from the Boston University School of Medicine, and he performed his residency training in emergency medicine with Harvard Medical School at Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham Health. He has worked in some of the largest and busiest emergency departments in the world, as well as some of the most remote and isolated ones. And currently, he is the Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine of USC. So, as you can see, this is going to be a fascinating conversation, and he's also very influenced by Stoicism as well. So, I can't wait for you to listen to this. So, without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Dan Dworkis. Alrighty, so Dan, I'm really excited to have you here today. You kind of reached out to me a couple of weeks ago and said, I kind of deal with a lot of the emergency response as an emergency ER doctor or surgeon, and I'm so excited to talk about all this with you because you can really bring us a unique perspective on, firstly, what people are dealing with at the moment with the whole crisis that we're seeing around the world, but also just how to be an effective human in an emergency situation or in any sort of difficult situation, which we often find ourselves in. Obviously not to the extent that you've found yourself in, but for those who don't know you, I just want to give you an opportunity at the start to tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll jump straight in.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me on this. I'm really excited to come and talk to everybody about this. I hope it brings some strength and peace to folks who are listening, because I know all of us need more of that right now. So my name is Dan Dworkis. I am a emergency doctor in Los Angeles, California. I work at LA County Hospital, and I am the founder and creator of the Emergency Mind, which is a platform that takes lessons from experts in the emergency department and also beyond about how to get things done in a crisis and apply knowledge under pressure. And one of the real pillars we rely on in terms of building our response to emergencies is Stoicism. It's something I've been a fan of and a student of for sort of, as we were talking before this, sort of as long as I can remember, really. So I'm super happy to come on and talk about that.
Yeah, awesome. And, I really want to delve into that a little bit more, this idea that Stoicism can help us to get the right psychology for an emergency response. But maybe what I wanted to start with was maybe to give you the opportunity to give us a few examples of the kind of emergency situations that you might deal with and the kind of stress that you would be under in those circumstances, so that we have that context there. And I mean, situations that emergency responses, let alone what's happening right now, right? Like, we can't even fathom how some doctors are dealing with what's going on right now. But tell us what a typical day in the office for you might look like, and what you're training people to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Typical day in the office is a fun way to say that. So, I mean, first off, I'm happy to share some stories about that. But I think that more important than sort of the craziness that I go through sometimes is the idea that ER doctors or not, all of us face emergencies in our lives, and we might not face them every day, but we will face them. And these moments, and if you think back in your own life, or if you're listening to this in your own life, you think about the times that were the most sort of pivotal in your existence, those are probably emergencies in one way or another, right? Emergencies are the things that are the climax of the movie, right? They're the times when like things are really gonna just skew off and change the entire course of your existence. And so when I think about emergencies, what we're talking about is situations that have really three aspects to them, right? So there's uncertainty, which is that we don't know what's going to happen and we don't know what the right action to take is. There's impact, which is that whatever happens in this situation really truly matters, right? Like if you're standing in line to get a coffee and you're not really sure which kind of coffee you're going to choose, back when we used to stand in line in places for coffees and things, there's uncertainty, but that's not really impactful in any deep, meaningful way. And the third thing is that there's pressure on top of all of this. So you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision now. And if you don't make a decision now, then things go completely off the rails. So pressure, uncertainty, and impact, that's really what defines an emergency. If you look through the situations that we find ourselves in the emergency department, right now, what we're all geared up for, of course, is the COVID-19, the corona epidemic, pandemic, excuse me. And a lot of these decisions we're having to make are really complicated decisions about sort of what support is the best to give somebody when they're really crashing. So a patient might come in and they're having a lot of trouble breathing, and you might not exactly know, hey, is their breathing going to get better with some treatment, or is it going to get immediately worse? Should I put them to sleep and put a breathing tube in and take over breathing for them? These are big life and death decisions, right? There's huge amounts of impact. If you get it wrong, the patient dies. There's a ton of uncertainty, both in terms of what happens for this patient and then in general as we're sort of learning this disease as humanity. And then there's the pressure of, if you don't make a decision right now, you might not get another chance to make that decision a few minutes later.
Yeah. Yeah, and now that you're talking about that, I remember back to when I used to watch episodes of MASH, and there would be these scenes where they would have an influx of people come into the hospital, and these doctors. I know it's a TV show, but this is real life as well, right? Like there's situations where you have to make uh, extreme ethical and moral decisions on maybe who you're going to treat first, how you're going to treat somebody. Does this person need help more than this person? And if I treat them first, is this person going to die? Like, these are questions that really should lead us to thinking that philosophy should also be the study of, and virtue and ethics and logic should be the study of a doctor or an emergency response person, right? Like, because these can help us to make these kinds of decisions. Do you think that there's an element there of a need to study not only the practice of medicine, but also the study of ethics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are one and the same practice in a lot of ways, right? I mean, you can
Yeah.
study medicine in theory. You can write down your sort of axioms about the gallbladders connected to the, whatever. But it's not really about that. It's about understanding the best knowledge that humanity has to offer and how to give it to that patient right now when they need it, and also to that community when they need it. And part of that does involve the idea of like, well, how do you manage scarce resources, which unfortunately in several parts of the country and the world, we always see that in a lot of the world, right? In places that don't have as much resources as we would want. But we're seeing it now, I think, in a scale that is really unprecedented given the pandemic. And there are a lot of these hard decisions. Thankfully, not in Los Angeles at the moment. We're still doing okay. But I think that you might learn it from a textbook, but medicine is about people. Medicine is about applying knowledge to people. So there's
Yeah.
no way to get around it.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I wanted to dive into the nitty gritty of emergency response, what it means to act effectively, what it means to act ineffectively, so that we know the difference. When you're training people, maybe you could give us a few examples of, let's say, what's a typical response that you see to an emergency situation that would be ineffective? Like, what
Mhm.
happens in our psychology, even our physiology, that
Sure.
leads to an ineffective response? Then what leads to a really good response? And how do you train people? Sorry, this is a loaded question. Then how do you train people to go from that ineffective response to an effective response?
Yeah, absolutely. So our body and our mind together, I always tend to think of it as like, they're our brave companion on this journey, right? They're doing the best that they can. And you get this set of programming in terms of the way your body and mind are linked together and what your innate response is. And, you sort of have this innate reaction to things. And the way I sort of think about it is if you put a bunch of first year medical students together in a room and you try to get them to resuscitate somebody, to take a really critical case, even if they're smart people, which they probably are, nothing's going to happen the right way. Most of them are going to do some version of panic. They're going to do some version of shutdown. They're going to freeze. Even if they have some knowledge, they're not really going to be able to deliver that knowledge to the patient in the way that the patient needs it. And then if you take those same group of people and you put them through several years of training and an emergency medicine training specialty program, now all of a sudden they're walking into the room that has the same amount of pressure, uncertainty, and impact in it, and they're handling it in a completely different way. And some of that is sheer knowledge, right? Some of that is knowing, okay, well, if the patient doesn't have a pulse and they're in a wide complex, ventricular arrhythmia, then I'm going to give 300 milligrams of amiodarone. Okay, cool. That's like a nice fact of knowledge. But really, it's about how do you access that knowledge and deliver it to the patient right then when everybody's screaming and there's blood everywhere. And hopefully they're not screaming, right? Because you're managing the room better than that. But when there's all this sort of like extra pressure going on, how do you map that knowledge onto that case? And so the way that I've started sort of thinking about this was this idea of the emergency mind, right? So the emergency mind is the set of tools, algorithms, and responses that you use when you find yourself in an emergency, right? We all have one. Everybody has an emergency mind. The problem is if you haven't trained it, it probably sucks, right? Which is if you look back at your life, and I look back at my life when I started doing this, you put me in front of an emergency and I would, some version of that, that inflatable inner tube kind of thing they have at the car salesman sometimes that sort of does the wavy
Yeah,
arm thing. Like that's
I
a
know
pretty good.
exactly what that is, and I know
Yeah,
exactly the feeling that that feels like.
absolutely. Right. And that's pretty natural. That's what we all generally start with. The opposite of that is what the emergency mind is about. It's about being able to come into a place calmly, to understand what's happening, to accept reality, to act from where you have control, to deploy this idea of sang-froid, right, which is this wonderful French word that means cold-blooded, but really is, sang is blood and froid is cold. You mash them together and you get the ability to perform under pressure.
Hmm.
And then you try to link it all together to play for the future and to play for humanity. And you do that despite the pressure, uncertainty, and impact. And in fact, you do it in a way where you're better under the circumstances of pressure, uncertainty, and impact. That's
Hmm.
what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I know that before the show we were kind of discussing your relationship with Stoicism and your
Mhm.
study since, for before you could even, really remember where it came from. But how do you think that Stoicism has influenced the way that you see the emergency mind, our response to these emergencies?
Yeah, I think it's really, really crucially important. And I think that if you want to be somebody who performs well under pressure, whether that's the pressure of your sort of day-to-day life, or that's you really want to train yourself to be able to handle an emergency, even if you're not an ER doctor, right? You want to handle the real emergencies. You have so much to learn from Stoicism. Stoicism has so much to give us. Um, shocker, I'm going to say that we're on a podcast talking about how great
Yeah.
Stoicism is, but nevertheless, I totally believe
I
it.
always welcome an objective view, right? Like if you've got bad
Yeah,
things to say about Stoicism, I really don't mind. But obviously you reached out because you felt like there would be a link there as well, and that's what I'm interested in.
absolutely. And I think if anything, I talk about it too much. I would imagine my residents that I'm training are a little sick of hearing about Stoic philosophy at some point or another.
Yeah.
Um, but for me, there's several threads that really link the two, and we can take this in any direction that you want. But
Mm.
but fundamentally, Stoicism is about accepting the reality of the world around you and building the best version of yourself that you can in that reality. And that's exactly what you need to do in an emergency, right? You find yourself in a room and somebody is not breathing. If you try to deny that reality, you try to say, well, why is this happening to me? I don't understand. This isn't fair. This isn't the way life's supposed to work. Yeah, that person is still not breathing. And you just wasted that couple of minutes talking about how unfair it is. And man, they need that oxygen, right? They don't have time for you to
Mm.
do that. Instead, if you come in and you say, yeah, wow, this is really suboptimal. This isn't what I want. Hey, here's the deal. This person's not breathing. This is the reality. What can I do about this? You know, Stoics are awesome at stepping forward and making that happen. And you get it all the way back. Marcus Aurelius is talking about the closer a person is to a calm mind, the closer they are to their strength, right? You talk about this whole locus of control idea that all the Stoics are about. That is so much of about improving your ability to respond to any situation, but certainly to an emergency.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned earlier about this idea that over time your students will go from having a pretty bad response to the emergencies, not
Mhm.
necessarily to their fault. It's just because that's where they're at. But then over time, through practice, they obviously get the right knowledge, they get the right skills, and it just becomes naturally a better response to these situations. What do you think the importance is of rehearsing these difficulties? Because I know the Stoics talked about this time and time again. It's
Mhm.
like, hey, you want to not be afraid of poverty, practice being poor, and then you'll know that it's not actually that stressful and it's not bad at all. So what's the kind of rigorous routine that you would put through your
Sure.
students to in order to get that strength and practice there?
Sure. And I think there's a really important sort of misconception in what you just said, which is that this sort of ability to respond to emergencies, to deploy a successful and strong emergency mind, happens as sort of a happy accident from training. And I
Mm,
don't actually think that's true. I think that you certainly cannot get a functioning emergency mind unless you practice in emergencies, but it's not just time on target. It's dedicated time on target, consciously training yourself. And you can
yeah.
easily put reps in without actually getting any better at it. Um, if that wasn't the case, right, if it was just time on target, then always the oldest person in the room in the emergency would be the best at it. And that's not
Mm,
always true, right? And
yeah.
really it's the person that's really invested themselves in sharpening their own mind and their own ability to do something. Um, so I agree with you. It definitely has to be a conscious process in there. And I tend to think about this in terms of like multiple concentric circles, right? So there's like the what Stoics have to offer us in the exact second of pressure, uncertainty, and impact. And then what do Stoics have to offer us in the broader sense of how we train ourselves to prepare for this kind of thing. A great example of that is what you just said about thinking ahead about what's going to happen, right? This Stoic concept that I love but can never pronounce appropriately, like premeditatio malorum, or however you say
Yeah.
that, right?
Or negative visualization, whatever you put
Exactly,
it.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when I'm in a room and somebody's not breathing and I'm getting set up to intubate them, right? I'm going to put them to sleep. I'm going to put a breathing tube in their mouth. I'm going to hook them up to a ventilator, something we're all doing quite a bit of these days with the COVID epidemic, um, COVID-19. In that moment, I am doing premeditation malorum. I'm doing negative visualization in like the 1 or 2 moments leading up to actually paralyzing them. I'm
Mm,
looking at the person. I'm thinking, okay, what's going to go wrong here? What are my backup moves? What does their anatomy tell me? What does their physiology tell me? If this fails, what's my backup? If that fails, what's my backup? And I'm okay with that because I've practiced and rehearsed going for my backup tool. And I've visualized myself stumbling and recovering over and over and over again. We talk a lot about the idea of, okay, so just to really zoom in on this for a second. So you've paralyzed the patient, so they're not breathing. So it's up to you to breathe for them. They have a certain amount of time with which the oxygen they have in their body will sustain them, and then that will run out and they will die if you don't do anything. So let's say you go in and you put this little sort of curved blade, it's called a laryngoscope. It's not sharp, but you put it in their mouth to move the tongue out of the way so you can get the breathing tube in. And you set up to do that. If you see the vocal cords, great. You can get the tube in most of the time. Awesome. What if you don't? What if something doesn't quite work the right way? You have to adjust yourself on the fly within those couple of seconds, understand what the problem is, change your approach, and make a second pass that's going to succeed where the first pass failed. You have to understand that that will happen some percent of the time. So ahead of that, you have to have thought about that. If you haven't thought about that, if you haven't done this negative visualization, man, you got a person that can't breathe and you're fumbling around trying to find the airway. That is an unpleasant situation.
mm,
Conversely, if you think about it ahead of time, you rehearse the idea that you are fallible, you are not perfect, you will miss the first time some of the times. You're going to train yourself to get ready to reach for that backup tool to make your adjustments and to move.
mm,
At the same time, you zoom back out, right? And now all of a sudden you're thinking about emergencies in general and you're thinking about the next 10 patients that are going to come in. What's going to happen? Is your team ready? Do you have enough resources? Do you have the backup resources? When this whole COVID-19 pandemic started, we had a screening program that only asked people if they'd been to Wuhan, China. Okay, that was a good first pass, right? And we were sort of shuttling them into different places based on how they answered that question. So my first response to that screening program was, oh, okay, well, what happens when we miss them in the first point, right? What happens when they get through the first point and get into the ER? What do we do about it then?
Mm.
And I think that discipline of always thinking ahead about what the Stoics teach us about sort of imagine these bad things are going to happen and what you do about them, how do you respond, is invaluable for emergency care. It's
Mm.
probably more than you ever
Yeah.
want to know about intubation, but
No, that was awesome, and this is exactly the reason why I love having people from so many different disciplines on the show who have been influenced by Stoicism or even not, because uh, when you start talking about it, I'm even seeing a different perspective of Stoicism that it's almost as if one of the greatest benefits is that it allows you to pick the right things to put importance on in your mind, as in like you're thinking about the right things at the right time and you're seeing things from the right perspective at the right time as well.
hmm,
It's like in that moment when you know you need to focus really closely on one specific task, you focus on that specific task. You don't focus on the past, you don't focus on necessarily what
yeah,
could have happened. You focus on what can I do right now. And then when you know that something is safe there, then you can say, cool, now I look at the broader picture and I step out of it. So there's a real a value in being able to quickly change the perspective from which you're looking at the situation. Would you say that
yeah.
that's probably like a real valuable aspect of emergency response?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
Mm.
Being the value placed on being useful in the moment, however you can, right? And that's
Mm.
certainly something that the Stoics think about and dig into, right? You want to be effective. You want to think about where you have that locus of control. Where can you make a difference? I always think about, I think it's Epictetus. It might be Seneca. I'm sorry, I'm coming off of a night shift. I don't have quite the like recall of stoicism that I'm,
We'll
I'm
forgive
usually
you.
having. Yeah. But he talks about, let's say you're on a sea voyage and your ship is capsizing and you realize you're going to drown, right? What do you have left in that moment? What is your job? And I love the way that he says, well, your job is to drown and drown fearlessly, because like if that's all you've got left, like you're going to do it, right? But it's that
Yeah.
idea of like there is not a single moment in existence where you cannot do something of use to humanity.
Yeah.
Totally fervently believe that.
Yeah, or yourself. Like that because dying courageously isn't
Mhm.
necessarily doing something for humanity, but for yourself, it goes back to this stoic idea of living virtuously right to that very, very last moment, right?
Mhm.
Like you always have the choice, no matter what situation you're in, even if you're dying or you have the choice to die, that choice to make sure that you're living with virtue and
Mhm.
courageously. That's a brilliant story as well. But um, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to touch on again. How it's important to recognize that your body is doing the best that it can. I
Mm.
think that's really important. Something that I tell my clients often is that uh, when it comes to your own personal change or improvement, you have to go by Epictetus's definition of the most effective way to change, which is a mixture of self-scrutiny and also self-kindness, right? So you
Mm.
need to make sure that you're always picking apart, how you could be acting better, but also you need to have that aspect of your character that says, well, I'm doing the best that I can, and
Mm.
and I will only ever try to do the best that I can, and I can't move faster than what I can move, right? How important do you think it is for people in these moments of I guess training the mind, and in the moments where
Mm.
you're trying to get better at responding to situations or emotions or anything like that, how important is it for people to recognize that they can only move as fast as they can move, and they can only be on level 2 or level 3. They don't need to be at level 20 right now.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it doesn't do us any good to beat ourselves up as we're moving through it, right?
Mm,
You want to train effectively and become better. That's your goal, right? Your goal is not to be perfect at this second. Your goal is to continue to train to be better and better. And I think that's true constantly. That's you know, when I look back at sort of like my own course of training through that, and this is true if I look back at my training in martial arts or I look back at my training in emergency medicine or anything, which is that you're always trying to push yourself to keep moving, and you also realize that there is no finished endpoint. There's no finished martial artist. There's no finished stoic. There's no finished emergency doctor, right? We're all in this continuing to learn and grow. And your job is just to do whatever you can with what you have and keep moving forward. Um, and, I think to sort of directly answer your question, any energy we spend beating ourselves up is energy that we're not spending either getting better or delivering medical care to the patient. And it's just
Mm.
not effective, right? Our patients, and you can replace patients with clients or with family or with whatever you want to replace it with, but the people we are working to, or ourselves, right? The people we are working to serve, they need us to deliver the whole of our intention to them. They don't have space and time for us to beat ourselves up with half of it. Not to say that there's not frustration, because there certainly is,
Hmm.
right? But there's a difference between being frustrated and needlessly beating yourself up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I could imagine that you deal with many situations where, you look back on the situation and you say to yourself, maybe if I had have done something differently,
Mhm.
somebody could have got a better result, or maybe I could have, how important
Yeah.
is it for people to shake off that real, man, looking to the past like that and looking at
Hmm.
all the things that you could have done better? How important is
Hmm.
it to shake that off and try to focus on, okay, yes, I can do better next time, but it's not going to help me to ruminate on that.
So, yeah, I think that nobody does emergency medicine without losing patients, without having people and families go through really challenging, terrible outcomes. Um, that said, I think the incredibly important discipline, uh, and I think the Stoics would probably agree with me on this, is to never waste suffering,
Hmm.
to never waste suffering, to understand that if there is suffering, that you try to minimize it, but whatever there is, that you need to use it as fuel for change. And the worst thing you could do is make a mistake, have somebody suffer, and not learn or grow from it. That's pretty terrible.
Hmm.
If it does have to happen, if there is a suboptimal outcome, if there's something really horrible that happens, then your job essentially is to transform that into something better for the next person. So I'm
Hmm.
always thinking about, every shift, how can we get better? How can we get better to treat the next wave of patients that come in? Because look, I'm imperfect, right? I'm an imperfect person, and I practice an imperfect craft, and I practice it imperfectly. That's just the reality. I'm a human.
Hmm.
There's going to be mistakes and people are going to suffer. But can I, over the course of my career, can I build enough of, what's the right way to put that? Can I build myself enough to the point where when something does happen, I'm able to use it to become better tomorrow? Um,
Hmm.
and I think the Stoics talk about that a lot, right? So for me, when I read that quote by Epictetus about drowning fearlessly, the unsort of spoken part in my head about why I think this is about for the benefit of humanity is that, can you drown fearlessly so that somebody else watching from the shore is like, whoa, why did that guy do that? Why did he
Hmm.
behave like that when he drowned? Why wasn't he flailing like this other person over here? Right? And in that way, you create something that allows that suffering to be used in a meaningful way. Um,
Hmm.
and I wish I could say, here's the magic answer of how to do that. It's really challenging. It's like the deepest, most challenging things that we deal with as humans is transforming suffering into growth. But that idea of not wasting that suffering, and I think that's particularly important right now in the setting of this pandemic, when all of us are suffering to one degree or another. How do we not waste that suffering? How do we grow ourselves and our communities as we're doing it?
Hmm. Yeah, I like what you're saying there about kind of the person on the shore. It's kind of the ultimate definition of somebody in a leadership position, right? Is,
Mhm.
they might not necessarily be telling everybody, hey, this is how you remain calm in the situation. They might just be simply being calm in the situation. And something about humanity really
Yeah.
is infectious in those situations, right? Like if
Mhm.
if I'm if I'm
Terrible
six
choice of
levels
words,
below
but
the
yes.
leader and I say that
Yeah.
the leader is extremely calm and dealing with the situation and doing well, uh, that is definitely going to feed into the way that
Mhm.
I react to the situation as well, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, sorry, I'll let you comment on that.
No, no. There's a Epictetus talks about talks about not just talking about philosophy, but about living it, right? He talks about sheep, and he goes, sheep don't eat grass and then vomit it back up to be like, hey, shepherd, look what I just ate, right? They
Yeah.
eat the grass and then they produce wool and milk. And so the
Mhm.
shepherd is able to see what has happened, right? In the same way that you're talking about, leaders don't often have to say, hey, everybody, be calm under pressure. In fact, that's often doesn't really help anything at all, right? But you
Mm.
can show the result of your own training like that. You can show the wool and milk of your training by being calm under that pressure, and that it does that creates those ripples out from you in terms of your team and your family and everybody around you.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to touch on your martial arts training as well, because
Mm.
I understand that you're heavy into your martial arts, whether it's Taekwondo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Uh, how does that discipline help you to? How does that transfer into all areas of your life? Because I know that the Stoics talked about, how every discipline will feed into the other, right? Like we want to make sure that our training, obviously helps us in all areas of our life. How does it help you?
Yeah, Miyamano Musashi, the author of the Book of Five Rings, said, if you know the way broadly, you will see it in all things. And I think
Mm,
that's true in the sense that any training that you put into yourself to sharpen your version of yourself, to sharpen your own sword, is training that will help you in all of your other spaces. I am a very, I'm lucky to have been introduced to martial arts at a pretty young age by my family, and to have a initial martial arts instructor who was really deep into the philosophy of it, and understood that like it's not just about learning to throw a punch and a kick, it's about sharpening your mind so that you can respond better to existence. um, Incredibly fortunate for that. And lately I am incredibly lucky to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu out here in LA, which is just wonderful, and I have an incredible professor that I study with. And um, but that constant discipline of throwing yourself into situations where you are uncomfortable and training yourself to react there, right? You're finding these situations of pressure, uncertainty, and impact a little different than in the ER. But if you're in a jiu-jitsu, you're rolling, there is pressure, there is uncertainty, and there is impact, right? And you're training yourself to be in these situations and to train your response to them over and over and over again. Um,
mm,
the former Navy SEAL and leadership expert like Jocko Willink talks about this kind of thing a lot when he talks about jujitsu and sort of why everybody should train jujitsu, to the point where you're out there throwing yourselves in these situations that are oftentimes extremely uncomfortable and really challenging, and you're watching how you respond to it, right? You're polishing yourself with the, what's that Seneca quote, like, gems can't be polished without friction, and neither can a person without trial, something like that.
yeah, yeah. I
not
know the
not
one
like
that
a
you're talking about.
okay.
I'm not going to do a better job of you than paraphrasing that.
Yeah, but that idea that like if you want to be able to perform under pressure, you have to train yourself under pressure. And the truth is that all of our lives, whatever we do, involves performance under pressure. Every single person. There's not a career out there that I know of that doesn't have performance under pressure. um, and so you have to train yourself. You have to become a student of pressure, right, in one way or
Mm,
another. And I think martial arts is a really wonderful, visceral way to do that. Plus it's incredibly fun.
yeah, yeah. Do you have any other disciplines that you kind of used in order to train your mind to be better under pressure?
um, hmm. I am doing. I am an exceedingly beginner at learning how to surf. I'll tell you that out in
Okay.
LA.
Yeah.
That's been a great example of it. I'm looking over at my surfboard in the corner here, which is sadly in the corner because the beaches are closed here in LA at
Yeah.
the moment. But I think that's a really interesting example too, because that's just such a wildly different thing that I'd never really spent any time doing.
Mm,
And it's fun to watch yourself react to a new situation and be like, I'm somebody who studies Stoic philosophy, I study martial arts, I study performance under pressure, and I still get out there and there's a giant wave and I'm like, what is this? What is happening? Right. And it just great to get back to that beginner's mind of like, oh, cool, let's see what happens when you do this. So
yeah. Yeah. No, I love it. And I've only got a couple more questions that I wanted to ask.
yeah.
One of them, I guess, it's difficult to know how to ask this question respectfully. So I know, don't be afraid. I've known, various people within the health industry or within,
Mhm.
say, the emergency response industry, people like police officers, people like
Mhm.
emergency call center workers, and they all seem to have a really dark sense of humor that is almost necessary for them, right? Because when you're
Hmm.
dealing with the darkest elements of humanity, whether that's chasing down a criminal who could kill you, or you're trying to save somebody's life in an emergency situation, that's a dark moment in life that
Hmm.
can take a lot out of you, right? If you don't learn how to see the, I guess, you could even look at it from the perspective of what Seneca taught, right? He said that it shows a better character to laugh at life than to bemoan it, right? Because it shows the lighter side of life. Like nothing should be too serious that you can't allow yourself to relax after the
Hmm.
situation and see the humor in it. The Stoics also talked about, many of these situations that we find horrifying today, tomorrow will seem absolutely trivial, right? What do you think if you think this, what do you think the importance is of learning to find humor in situations that can be so dark that they would take it out of you if you didn't find that humor? And again,
Yeah.
that's why I say that I don't know whether this is going to come off disrespectful, because I want that question to be as respectful as possible.
No, of course. And I think that you know, there are things that happen, and I'm thinking as we're talking about this about some of the cases that I've worked on where, for instance, a child has died, and there is no there is nothing funny about that.
Of course.
It's horrible, right? But you know, you have to decide at some point that whatever happens, you're going to get back up tomorrow and do it again,
Mm,
right? That no matter how bad it looks, you're going to wake back up tomorrow and try to do a better job than you did today.
mm,
And if you really believe that, then you find a way to see what happens and to feel it and to not be numb to it, right? To understand the life and to see it. And you see this horrible thing, this incredible dark thing that happens. And then later in the day, you also see a friend of yours trip and spill coffee on themselves, or something
mm,
incredibly funny, right? Not that
yeah.
my friend spilling coffee on themselves is that funny, but or you see a different child who is an incredibly sweet little kid that like laughs hysterically about something. And like
Mm,
that's also life. And the Stoics are so much about digging into life for what it is and all of its
mm,
beauty and pain all together, right? I think there's this incredible misconception that Stoics are not moved by anything, right? The way we sometimes use Stoicism and or being a Stoic in English about like, oh, it just means you're not moved, like you don't have a response to it. But not at all, man. I think Stoics feel and see the depth and the beauty of everything that goes on around them. They feel the pain, they feel the joy, and they keep walking forward anyway. And to me, Stoicism is about that choice. It's about saying, I'm going to get back up tomorrow and be a better version of myself than I was today. And
mm,
part of that is finding the beauty in existence around you, despite the pain and despite the suffering about what's going on. Um,
yeah.
and sometimes that comes out as some really terrible jokes in the middle of the heat of it. Absolutely, right? But
Yeah.
but more often, it's that version of what is the totality of the reality that I'm going
Mm.
into.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, you've got to stay sane, right? Like if
Mm,
all that you
try
see,
to.
yeah, if all that you see is the pain and suffering, that can only lead to nihilism,
Mm,
and that's not good for anyone. And I think that you're right there. It's like the Stoics taught us that it's not about not being moved; it's about being moved in the right way at the right time in the right place. And that actually, there's a real truth in what the Stoics said about how, nobody but the sage can really experience and express
mm,
true love, right? Nobody
mm,
but the sage can really experience and express all of these emotions in the right way, because so much of the way that we express our emotions, really, if you examine it, it's not the right place, or it's not the right time, or it's not the right emotion.
mm,
and
mm,
and Stoicism is about learning to be really intelligent with the way you express those emotions. And when you're around somebody like that who can express their emotions intelligently, who can cry with you when you need them to cry with you, who
yeah.
laugh with you when you need them to laugh with you, there's a real emotional intelligence there that we can learn from the Stoics. And onto another kind of element of our character that can be helpful. Uh, what do you think that the role of creativity is in a crisis? Because I know that you've probably dealt with many situations where you don't have what you need, you don't have
Mhm.
the people that you need. Where does the creativity come in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all, to greater or lesser degrees, think of ourselves as MacGyvers in emergency medicine, right? The idea that we'll invent our way out of whatever situations are going on. And I think if you were a fly on the wall in our ERs right now, and you're watching us think through how to invent better responses to the COVID epidemic, we're literally duct taping pieces together and saying, okay, well, what if we did this? Like, would that deliver oxygen better in this circumstance? Like, without exposing people to virus? Like, how can we make this just this constant stream of invention? Which part of that goes back to the don't waste suffering idea, right? The idea that anything that our patients are going through, we want to be able to treat the next person in the door better than that person that comes in. That's part of our commitment to our patients. Um, I think that having the, like, in some sense, part of the opposite of creativity is fear, right? And brittleness of response. And I think that if you go, and this sends all the way back to the Stoic idea of like memento mori, right? Remembering that you're mortal is one of the key concepts of this. And if you start with that, and you start addressing the fear of death, and you start addressing the fear of response, and you sort of build outward from that, what you get is not fear, but the space to be creative, right? The space to
Mm.
really flex and have an appropriate adaptable response to what goes on around you. Um, and some joy to approach it with, right? The idea of, again, the Stoic idea of amor fati, right? To play whatever hand of cards you're dealt with joy.
Mm.
And there is some definite joy and satisfaction in jury rigging something that works amazingly well like that. Like, that's always a
Yeah.
great moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, every invention starts with some creativity, right? It's like we have a
Hmm.
problem, we don't know how to fix it, and somebody's got to come up with something.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could argue that that's one of the main reasons why, like, times of war or times that we're dealing with right now, are almost the best for creativity, because we're forced into a situation where we need to learn how we can deal better with the situations of life.
Yeah.
And,
And I think that's also really true in terms of your own self, right? Like creativity in terms of rewiring yourself. Like, I always
yeah.
think about it like, man, things are terrible. It's really challenging. Sort of like, you've already got the hood up on your car. So you can also fix some stuff while you're in there, right? You're
Mm.
going through the intellectual and sort of like existential pain of changing your vision of yourself and your vision of humanity. Like, you're in there tinkering around. You may as well swap some components out while you're in there and try to give yourself a better engine on the other side of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Constantly trying to improve whatever situation
Hmm.
you're dealt. And
Yeah.
I guess the last question that I wanted to ask you,
Hmm.
as an emergency ER doctor, what can we do when we come into the hospital and we've got an emergency?
Hmm.
When we, eh, when we're the ones on your table, if we can talk to you, like, what can people in the public do that would support you in what you're doing, like from the opposite side of an emergency, right? How do you think people would best respond from the opposite side of what you're seeing?
That's a really interesting way to ask that question. I'm not sure I've ever heard that asked in terms of like, if I find myself on your table, which I hope that you never do.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that there is a difference between compassion and empathy, right? And I think that empathy is seeing suffering in another human, and that causing a mirror image of that suffering in you, right? So, your sister is sad and crying, and so you are sad because of that, and you showed that by being there and crying. Compassion is sort of more of the idea of, you see suffering and it produces in you the desire to fix that thing, or to respond in a way that helps the person through that suffering. And it looks really different, right? You're maybe not there crying with the person. Instead, you're there sort of like fixing or helping or just being a sounding board or something like that. And I think that when I have my emergency gear on and I am being an emergency doctor, I don't often provide empathy as much as I provide compassion. But
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that I don't love and care about the person as a human. But I think that to really do my job well, the person who is sick needs me to be about compassion and not empathy. They don't want an ER doctor that breaks down and cries when they're hurt, right? They want an ER doctor that gets in there and helps them fix it. And I think that can come off in that situation as being gruff or uncaring. And I wish that I had the time to sit down with everybody and explain this and be like, hey man, like human to human, I love you, but like, I'm just going to pull on that bone a little bit right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, but that and if you find yourself in an emergency, you don't waste that suffering either, right? You go home and you think about that and you try to figure out what happened. How did you respond to it? How can you do better about it? As I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about coming into this, there was something that really stood out to me, which is Seneca's letters, number 91. Right, Seneca letter 91. It's called about the burning of Lyon, where he talks to his friend about the city of Lyon burning overnight. And if you sit down and read that, and that's my challenge to anybody listening to this, right? Is like if you were practicing Stoic, you go out and you read Seneca letter 91, and you think about how that reflects on the world today, because it talks about this vast, unanticipated, incredibly fast scale of chaos where the whole city burns overnight. And Seneca's, he's writing his letters to Lucilius and he's talking about sort of like advice on life as he goes through it. And he goes, how do you respond to a situation that is unprecedented, unexpected, and catastrophic, which is so much of what we're facing right now? And his advice is deep and meaningful and talks not only about how to handle the entire city burning, but also about how to use this as an impetus to retune yourself in terms of how you view the universe in general. So I don't know if I get to assign homework to listeners of this, but man, that's my homework. Go out and read Seneca letter 91. So,
you've given me homework now. I'm going to create a video reading out loud that
absolutely.
that letter and make sure that people can get that in the show notes as well. And because I can't remember that letter, but I'd love to go back and check that out because it seems like it relates to how we react today, right?
It's one of the ones that have stuck out to me the most in terms of its handling of essentially all of the 4 pillars of the emergency mind are in that letter, right? Like accept reality, act from within, deploy sang-froid, and play for the future. Like he talks about all of them. It's a great letter.
Awesome. Well, Dan, I'm so grateful that you came on the show, and seriously, I want to have you back many more times because I think this has just been such an enlightened conversation for me. You've taught me so much, and it's a testament to the idea that we need to be talking to people of all different disciplines about how they use Stoicism, because it can teach us so much more about how we might use it. So, Dan, thanks for coming on, and we'll talk to you next time.
Oh, my pleasure, man. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody listening to this stays safe and sane and healthy and keeps practicing.
Thank you. All right, so there you go, my interview with Dr. Dan Dworkis. Now, I'm sure you found that as fascinating as I did, and we're going to have him back on in the future. But make sure you head to his links in the show notes if you're wanting to find out what he's doing online. And without any further ado, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you next time. But until then, I hope that this episode has helped you on your rise to the good life. Ciao. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date with the Practical Stoic community and everything to do with this podcast, then just go to my website, simonjedrew.com, and subscribe to the Practical Stoic Weekly, a newsletter that I send out every week with updates and all sorts of great Stoic insights. You can also find me everywhere online by searching Simon J. E. Drew. See you next time.